Test, test, test. Ugh. What's up? Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to see how to display... Hey, what's up? Welcome back. In this episode, you'll learn how to display an issued card's virtual number directly to the customer. We're going to do it in a PCI compliant way. This is technically still in beta, but it should be out very soon, or it might be out by the time this video is out. So head over and take a look at the documentation for issuing and look around for how you might display the card details. So right now we have this view that shows the card holder, and we have the ID of the, like the Stripe ID of the issued card. If you are curious about what's going on here, you can head over and take a look at previous episodes where we are already generating card holders or generating cards. This episode is going to be all about showing those card details to the customer. So we want to make this ID a link, or maybe we might make this edit into a link that goes to a card show view to show the details of the card. Now, this is a little bit special because we're actually going to show a raw credit card number of an issued card to the customer. And so we need to be very careful about this, and we don't want that card number to actually like traffic anywhere through our server. So the way that this works is we're actually going to make an API call client side to Stripe with a special little nonce, and we're going to get back some details. But we'll walk through the whole thing. So the first thing is that we want to have this link go to the show page. So let's go to the card holder show, which is this page where we see this card ID already. And we're going to make this a link to the card path for card. And we'll also make this link that's down here. We'll also make this go to the card path for card. And instead of saying edit, we'll call this view. Okay, so now when we refresh this page, this is a link, and also this is a link. We should probably make this one look like it's actually underlined. So we can say class is underline. Okay, so now we can click on that link, and there is no show action in the cards controller. So we're gonna go to the cards controller and add a new show action. And for now, we're just gonna find the card in the current user.cards.find params ID. And it turns out that current user doesn't actually have an association for cards yet. So let's jump over to the user model, go down here. We're going to say has many cards through card holders. Okay. And now we don't have a view. So we'll go over to our views here for cards. And we're going to add a show.html.erb. And in here, we will actually like render out our card show. Now at the top, I'm just going to grab this. Okay, so card show looks, whoops. Okay, so our card show, we're just gonna say card at the top. Now we should be able to see some details about the card. Okay, we could even print out like, okay, at card.stripe ID, just to make sure that we're looking at the right thing. So that's the ID of the issued card. Now, in order to render the card on the page, I wanna make it look sort of nice. And so instead of writing all of the HTML here, I've got a gist that you can head over and take a look. If you want, you can feel free to copy this. This is all just using Tailwind CSS to build out a credit card looking thing. So what we've got here is just like, we're gonna print out the name, address, and card. Let me just show you. So this is what it's gonna look like. I think it looks pretty sweet. It's using some of like the gradient stuff, and it's rendering out, right now it's just rendering out a test card number, expiry, and CVV, CVC. If you look at the very bottom here, there's also an image so you can kind of get an idea of what that looks like. Now what we wanna do is actually replace this temporary or test card holder and test expiry and test CVC with the virtual issued card details. Now the way we're gonna do that is we're gonna use Stripe.js on the client side, and we're going to do a couple different things with an ephemeral key. So hang on tight. Here we go. All right, so what I want to do is I'm going to actually create a new stimulus controller that's going to manage this entire card view. So I'm going to say Rails G stimulus card, and that's going to generate a new controller that we're going to use to mount that div we just added. So on the card show here, this div, I'm going to call this data controller is card. Okay. Now, this card controller is inside of the connect. We're going to like initialize Stripe. We're going to fetch an ephemeral key from the server. And then we need to like retrieve the issued card. And then we need to like mount the issuing elements. So the name issuing elements might change. So when you're Googling around, just head over to the Stripe documentation and look under issuing for how you might display card details. So a lot of this is still in beta, but it's really cool and really powerful. So I wanted to just show you. If you're interested in participating in the beta, hit me up on Twitter at cjav_dev, or you can just email cjavilla@stripe.com. Okay, so what we want to do here is we're going to, in order to initialize Stripe, we need the publishable key. So we're going to have a couple different values here. So we're going to say static values is going to be some things. So we're going to need our Stripe key, and that's going to be a string. We're also going to need, in order to fetch the ephemeral key from the server, we're going to need the ID of the card in our database. We want to pass the database ID for that card. So that's going to be a number. We're also going to have the Stripe ID for the card. So we're going to say Stripe ID, and that's going to be a string. And we'll also have the Stripe account for the current creator. So this is going to be the Stripe account, and that's also going to be a string. All right, that's kind of a mouthful, but this should get us pretty far. So we're going to initialize Stripe. So we're going to say const Stripe is Stripe this.Stripe key. Actually, before we do that, now in order to get these values, we're going to pass those down with data attributes. So we're going to say data card ID is the card ID, and this needs to be dash value. Okay, so data card Stripe ID value is going to be at card.Stripe ID. Data card Stripe key value is going to be rails.application.credentials dig Stripe publishable key. And finally, we need the Stripe account. So this is going to be Stripe account value, and that's going to be current user dot account dot Stripe ID. Okay, so what we want to do first is just kind of like console.log all of these things. So we're going to say, this Stripe key, this ID. Actually, it's not values. It's this Stripe key value. That's how stimulus works. So we're going to say ID is this ID value, the Stripe ID, cool. And then the Stripe account is that Stripe account value. So let's just open up the console here and make sure that these values are being logged out. So we've got our Stripe key, our Stripe account, Stripe ID for the issued card. We have our publishable key. Okay, so all of that looks good. So now we can initialize Stripe. So we're going to say this.Stripe is a new instance of Stripe. We'll also here say this.elements is going to be a new instance of elements. So we're going to use Stripe.js elements on the client. Now, in order to use this class here, this Stripe class, we actually need to install Stripe.js. So we're going to do that everywhere by adding a script tag at the top of our application HTML ERB template, and that's going to install Stripe.js from js.stripe.com. And now we'll have access to that everywhere. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to fetch the ephemeral key from the server. So I'm going to say ephemeral key is this.fetch, or await this.fetch ephemeral key. And in order to fetch the ephemeral key from the server, we need to pass it a nonce. So I'm going to say nonce here. And in order to get that nonce, we need to use Stripe.js client side to create a nonce. So we're going to say this.create nonce. Okay, so async create nonce. What does this look like? Here we're going to call Stripe.create ephemeral key nonce. And we need to pass in the issued card here, the issuing card. And that's going to be this.Stripe ID value. And that should create a nonce for us. So after we create the nonce, we'll just console.log nonce here. And after we create the ephemeral key, we'll console log ephemeral key. Now, fetch ephemeral key is not defined, so let's define that. Async fetch ephemeral key. That is going to, again, take in the nonce. Now, we're going to use the fetch API to make a request to our server now with this nonce. So the first thing is when the page loads, The first call is off to Stripe to get a nonce back. The second call is down to our server with that nonce to generate an ephemeral key. Then we're going to use that ephemeral key to go back to Stripe to fetch the card. All of this stuff is in order to like really enforce security because we are about to retrieve these issued card details client side. Okay, so we're going to fetch the ephemeral key. So we're going to make a new API call here, and it's going to go to /card/ and then the ID of the card /ephemeral key. Now in the query string here, we're going to include the nonce, and we're also going to include the API version. And the reason we need to pass the API version is that it's possible in a lot of cases we use ephemeral keys in mobile clients where you might ship a mobile client and it's possible that the customer never like updates their app on their phone. And so they might expect the shape of the ephemeral key that's coming back from the server to have the format for a very specific API version. So we need to pass down our API version here. So I'm actually just going to pass down the most recent, which is 2022-08-01. And okay, so this fetch call is going to return a promise that will have a response on it. And we want the JSON off of that response. And we'll just return that entire thing when we fetch the ephemeral key. Now this, you might be paying attention closely and notice that like this route doesn't actually exist on our server yet. So we are going to need to go hit that up, but let's just refresh the page and see what happens. Okay, missing value for Stripe API key should be a string. So the first thing is we have an issue here. This should be Stripe key value. And now we refresh the page. Okay, let's console log this .stripe key value just to see what we're getting back. Okay, it's possible we have some error in our JavaScript. So let's, oh, you know what? Because we're using await here for these, I bet we need to have async on connect. Okay, let's see. Let's refresh. All right, so now we've got our Stripe API key. Now reference Stripe is not defined, so we're using Stripe somewhere here. This, yeah, so this should be called this dot. Okay, we want to pull it off of the controller. All right, now we're getting this error that says 404, where we have not actually been able to fetch the this API call. Also notice that this nonce is undefined. So in order to use this new API, I need to actually pass in a couple arguments to the construction of Stripe. Now, this is the first one is going to be the Stripe account, the ID of the Stripe account. That's going to be so that when we are when we're fetching these issued cards for connected accounts, it knows which connected account it should be authenticating on behalf of. The second is that we need to, because this is still in beta, we actually need to specify that this is for an issuing elements to beta. So now if we refresh the page, we should be getting back a nonce. This.create nonce. Oh, create nonce should return the nonce. Okay, so we refresh. All right, so now we are getting back a nonce. That's great. And our GET request is failing. So let's go generate a new controller for creating ephemeral keys. So we're going to say Rails G controller for ephemeral keys. And this is just going to have a show action. And we're going to put it in routes here. We'll nest it under cards, resource, ephemeral key. We're only going to have the show route here. So we'll go to ephemeral keys controller. And we want to make sure that users are logged in when they hit this route. All right, so the first thing we want to do is look up the card. So current user.cards.find params card ID. The next thing is we're going to create an ephemeral key. So we're going to use the Stripe API, and we're going to create this new ephemeral key. Now, again, we do need to pass the Stripe account header and the Stripe version. Stripe account is going to be current user.account.stripe ID. And the version, recall that this is passed in, so params version. Now we also need to pass in the nonce here. This is going to be params nonce. And we also need to pass in the issuing card. So we're going to say issuing card is at card.stripe ID. Notice that I'm not passing around the card ID value. Instead I'm the card's Stripe ID value. I'm passing around the card ID in our database so that I can look it up and confirm that this was from the database. Okay, so that should work pretty well. Oh, right, and then we want to just render the JSON back for this. Render JSON of the ephemeral key. So now if we refresh the page here, that network request, we got a 500 internal server error. So let's see what's going on there. Stripe version is missing a comma after here. Okay, refresh. All right, so now we have our ephemeral key back. That is looking really good. The next step is to use this ephemeral key's secret inside of the card controller in order to re-retrieve the card and then mount the issuing elements. So we're going to say const card result is await this.fetch card. And we're going to need to pass down both the ephemeral key and the nonce when we do this. So let's implement fetch card. So this is going to be async fetch card, and it's going to take in the ephemeral key and the nonce. And again, this is going to make an API call using the Stripe Stripe.js. So we're going to say retrieve issuing card, and we're going to pass in the Stripe ID value. And then we also need to pass in the ephemeral key secret, which is going to be ephemeral key.secret, and we need to pass in the nonce. And this should give us back a card result. So we're going to just return await this thing, and that should give us back a card result. All right, so now let's mount the elements. We're going to say this, we'll make a new method called mount elements. And here we can just call mount elements. And this is where we're going to mount each of the different elements. So we're going to have a card element, an expiry element, and a CVC element. Const number is going to be this.elements.create issuing card number display. And this is going to take in the issuing card, which is going to be this.stripe ID value. And it's also going to take in a possible style that we'll talk about in just a little bit. So then in order to mount this number element, we need to call number.mount. Now, in order to mount the element, we can pass in a CSS selector, or we can pass in an actual target. And so what we want to do is go back to our card show and create a way for us to target these elements. So the card number element here, let's actually change this to data card target for the number. And instead of putting 4 2s in here, I'm going to change this to asterisks, just so that it has like a placeholder that is not the actual number. While it's doing all of this client-side fetching, we will wait until we actually like load the number. So this is kind of like our loading state. All right, we also need to say data card target for the expiry. And again, this will be sort of just our placeholder text. And finally, our CVC. So we're going to say data card CV or target for CVC. And again, 3 stars. Okay, so now back inside of our card controller, we can set up some targets. So we can say static targets are the number, the expiry, and the CVC. Okay, now what we can do is we can use those targets to mount our element. So let's take a look at our browser now. If we refresh, we have our placeholder, and now we're rendering that virtual card number. So now that is the actual card number. Pretty exciting, okay? It's the wrong color, so let's talk about how we can style this. So in addition to passing in this issuing card number, we can pass in a style with a base, and we can say, I don't know, the color is white or something. That'll match the font color of our placeholder and everything. So that now matches, and that looks pretty nice. So we're going to follow the same pattern for the other elements. We need to pass in the issuing card, the style, and it's all going to be the same exact params for each of the other element creations. So let's actually extract these params, and we'll call them just params here. And then we're going to grab all of these and paste them here. And then we'll pass in this to each of the different elements that we create. So now we're going to create an expiry. That's going to be issuing card expiry, and we'll say expiry.mount expiry target. And we'll do the same thing with CVC, CVC.mount, CVC target. Now if we refresh, we can see our card number and our expiry and the CVC there. That's really cool. So now we are able to render an issuing card to the user so that they can go and actually use this card number and spend that the funds that are inside of this card. Recall that those funds are being sourced from this financial account balance. So the cards that we're issuing, those virtual cards that we're issuing, are tied back to the financial account that is inside of each of these creators' accounts. So we are logging into this creator dashboard. We have some funds that are flowing in from sales that are happening at our store. And as those sales come in, we have these customers, and these customers are spending money. But then as the creator, we can issue ourselves cards and then go and use those cards in order to spend some of that money from that store of funds, which is that financial account. So this is like really, really cool stuff. Very fun in order to render out the actual card numbers inside of the UI in a secure way that is PCI compliant, because these actual details are only trafficking through Stripe's servers directly. They're not actually showing up on your own server because they're being rendered client-side inside of this secure iframe. So very cool stuff. All right, we're going to wrap it there. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.